Welcome to Vermont Artists and Authors, where we interview great storytellers and artists from the amazing Green Mountain State. This is episode 11. I'm your host, Barney Smith of Storycomic.com, and we're excited to have with us Vermont author Robert Thorn. He's here to talk to us about his latest book, Beyond the Veil, Part 1, The Prophecy. And Robert, but you prefer Bob? Bob works as well? So
Yes. Yep.
okay.
Bob's good.
Bob's good. Okay. So Bob, so let's before we jump right into it, and like this is your inaugural book, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And so before we kind of talk about it, do you want to kind of give our viewers and our listeners a little bit of background on how you got into writing this book, that Beyond the Veil?
Yeah, I love to chat about that a little bit because that is interesting to me and it's something that is unfolding and I'm still figuring out. So I've actually found in talking about that and other questions people ask me about it, it's helping me figure out what the hell's going on here. Because it's somewhat accidental that I got into writing this book. But I retired 2 years ago and I wanted to start a new chapter in my life. So I remember building up to retirement thinking, I really don't want to have any plan or concrete idea about what I'm going to be doing. I want to just see what unfolds in an organic way. I knew a couple things that I wanted to do. I knew that I wanted to meditate some, go inward somewhat, and try to connect more with the genuine me. So I wanted to do that. And interestingly, I worked 40 years in the developmental mental health field, last 25 years as executive director of our regional developmental mental health center, and also taught management courses, graduate level management courses for 30 years. And I had in the back of my head, and again, I'm not sure how far back this goes, and it might be decades, that I was going to write a book when I retired. And one of the reasons why I wanted to do that is because I had unbelievably good materials that I thought would be important materials. So from a long, from a long time ago, I thought I would be a writer, and not at all where I went with my writing, but I thought I would be a writer. And then the other thing that is very consistent with this unfolding of my second chapter or my next chapter is that, and in writing and looking back at how I got to be a writer, I realized that I've always been a storyteller. So, I have so many instances that I look back and I think, well, this yeah, I've always been a storyteller, but I've just done it without thinking about it, and it's happened so many times and so often that now I see, yeah, I always wanted to tell stories, and just an example, we when I was at the University of Connecticut, we lived in this apartment. There were 4 units down and 4 units up, and we lived in one, and then next to us was a couple with a daughter who, I don't know, I think was 10, maybe something like that. I'm bad at guessing. It's so far removed from where I'm at right now. I'm within a decade. And she come over, and I was working. At that time, I was rebuilding the engine of my Volkswagen bus, and it was in the parts in the driveway. It was actually like the apartment building, then all paved in the front. So it was nice to do that. And she come over all the time. And I don't know how it started, but I just would always, when she came over, tell a story. And she'd run in the apartment because we were downstairs and go to my wife and say, truth or story? And my wife would always say, story. But it's funny how she continually needed to validate, is this truth or story, even though it never was truth. But at any rate, so, that's just an example. My nieces and nephews, when they would come over, I'd always have to tell stories. For a period there, it always had to be a scary ghost type story. And I don't even know what I was saying, but as long as I did plenty of these, wah, loud noises and sudden movements, so they could all freak out. They were happy, So, but the main reason and how I got into this was when we were living out in Bridport in a big farmhouse. My sister-in-law and her husband would come up to visit, fell in love with Vermont, and asked if they could move in with us while they looked for a place to live. And they did. And, we lived together for, I don't know how long, it seems like a couple of years anyway. And they had a daughter. And I would tell her, they have two daughters, but one was very young. But the one I'm talking about, Carrie, I tell her stories all the time. And I always remember this one occasion where I was working out in our garden and I was telling Carrie, who was, by the way, at the time, maybe 5 or 6, tiny little kids sitting on a cinder block. And I'm working away and telling stories, plagiarizing everything I know. The witch with snakes for hair jumped toward the 5-year-old blonde girl. By the way, I asked her recently, did it ever occur to you that the main character in every story I ever told you or wrote was your age, your description? And she said, no, I never realized
Oh, wow.
even to this day, she hadn't realized that. But anyway, I'm telling her the story, and all of a sudden I hear, stop. And I look around, and she's sitting on this cinder block, white as a sheet and shaking like
Oh, wow.
almost violently. And I said, oh, Carrie, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I didn't realize you were getting so freaked out. I shouldn't have said that. And she's got this stare. To this day, it's a stare that I can't figure out. It's like she was in some place that I've never seen or been in touch with through any other experience. But I said, I'm sorry, you okay? And I'm patting her on her back, and she's not looking at me, just staring ahead. And she says, go. And I said, what? You want me to continue? Go. I said, I don't think it's a good idea, Carrie. It's like, you're freaked out. Go. So the snakes jumped out. Stop. And she's shivering. I thought I heard a tooth crack. She was shivering so hard.
Wow.
And so that would happen all the time. By the way, I saw her mother at the door straining to say, what the hell are you telling my daughter? Carrie, it's time to come in. But this, to bring it full cycle, the Christmas after I retired, we get together at my house to do Christmas Eve. I get to cook, and then we exchange gifts. And so Carrie usually had bought me a bottle of wine, and it had a great theme on it, like Thorny Rose or Once Upon a Vine, all related kind of to our stories that we shared in the past. And by the way, when we moved away, I would write her stories and send them to her. And I actually found a couple of those that were pretty funny.
Oh, wow.
But anyway, I said, well, thanks. And there were 3 bottles. I said, thanks. She says, well, there's a catch. And I said, oh, okay, here it comes. What is it? And she said, I want you to write me a story using the themes on the names of the wines. And I take them out, and the themes are the prophecy. These are real wines. I have them. The prophecy, the dreaming tree, and the girl and the dragon. So my first thought was, okay, here's an assignment, more paperwork to take care of. But I sat down and fell in love with it. And the first story is the prophecy. And who would have guessed it's based on a bottle of wine? And that's how it came to be. And I'm working now on the girl and the dragon, and the last one will be the dreaming tree. So that's somewhat how it came to be.
So it's Beyond the Veil, Part 1, The Prophecy. And as you said, that's exciting. It's named after a bottle of wine. That's cool. So what will the readers get out of it? What's the back of the cover, basically, description of the book?
Well, that's another thing I've been struggling with. So I've asked people, how would you describe it? I've chatted with some people, and my daughter, who's my greatest fan, but also greatest critic. Um, but I really appreciate because she'll tell me if something doesn't seem right or whatever. And I guess it's like science fiction, dystopian, but to me that doesn't describe it at all. But I guess if I had to pick a genre, I would say that. But my influences are clearly my work.
Hmm.
The main character is a 15-year-old homeless girl living on the streets of Boston at the start of the story. Um, I definitely am influenced by gender issues. I mean, the main characters are strong females that, in spite of being held back by institutions, are going to do their thing without giving away too much about it. Um, and So influenced by that, and that comes from having a daughter. I've lived with two women. I have my wife and my daughter. Working with people who, many of whom are strong women, but have had unfair disadvantages as a result of gender. Having a lot of great nieces, and of course, just reading things that we read in the media that just seem criminal,
Right.
and you wonder how is this possible? It just seems so stupid. But anyway, there's that. I have a real interest in science, certain parts of science. I'm one of those people who knows a lot about or a little about a lot. I'll read something that's really interesting, but I won't, delve into it so deeply that I truly understand it. But the science, the theme for my book started out to be, uh, you know, truth is stranger than fiction. So almost everything I put in the book relates to something that is true, happened in reality, or is a strong theory in terms of cutting edge thinking around quantum mechanics or
Hmm.
the expansion of the universe or the speed of light and all of those kinds of things that, especially now, there's like a explosion of new thinking about things that we thought we knew in the past. And so that's the science. But there's a part in the book where Aria, who's the main character, goes to a lecture at MIT. Well, the lecture hall is the actual hall. The professor is really the head of mathematics department at um, MIT. It's the streets are real. It's that kind of stuff that I put in it just because, again, it's just I'm drawn toward that aspect of where the truth lies, as
Hmm.
outrageous as it may seem. But anyway, he does a lecture, and the lecture is about parallel universes, and um, and that's actually a book that this person wrote. It's taken from a book that was actually written about parallel universes. And so a theme in my book is there's three parallel universes that come together in a way not obvious to everybody, but they come together every 7,000 years. And this is the 7,000th year. And there are folks, I mean, most people involved in wherever they live, which are on planets in three different universes, are unaware of the reality of this crux that's formed with the parallel universes coming together. But there are some who have some understanding about it, some limited, but some are trying to utilize it. The other thing that I try to develop in it is the theme of good and bad or good and evil.
Hmm.
And it's sort of like the bird that eats the worm. Is the bird evil, or is
Right.
it just following its nature? And there are things inherent in different cultures or societies or whatever that are just different. And in this case, there are going to be different interests that are acting on behalf of their nature, but it just so happens that those natures conflict in dramatic ways, and there's going to be some tension, obviously, created about that. Um, but it looks into my daughter says, Dad, this is all your interest in philosophy, psychology, and religion, and it is. I realize that that's really what it is. So when I'm writing something, I'm thinking about something I've learned in psychology or thinking about something I've read in philosophy. I started as a philosophy major, by the way, and I got out of that fairly quickly because all the professors and the people in the department had this attitude of, and this is so unfair, but had this attitude of, oh, if you knew what I knew, you wouldn't be able to go on with life. And, it wasn't too much of a sense of humor that I encountered in my initial experience in the philosophy department. But I continued to read a lot of philosophy. I went through a period of reading the works of Plato and Aristotle, and I had a friend that went to St. John's Academy near Annapolis, or it's in Annapolis, and that all they do is study the classics. And you actually have to learn Greek so that you can read it in the original text. It's an amazing, and
Oh,
talking to
wow.
him, visited there a couple of times, and it's interesting.
As you said, there's like three parallel worlds that kind of converge every 7,000 years. So I guess my question for you as writing this, did you start off with the character and then kind of create a world around it, or did you have this idea of a storyline and you kind of infused your inspired characters into this?
Well, I think I definitely started with the character.
Okay.
I had within me this desire to talk about uh, people who have had disadvantage, young people who have had disadvantages, and I've just seen so much of that. They work so much harder, even with all their disadvantages, than the average person
Right.
who might whine. This is unfair too, but might sit and whine that they don't have enough money for the cruise or whatever. And so I had that character in my head when I started writing this, and and I didn't know where it was going to go. I didn't know it was going to end up being science fiction, and I'm not really sure, how it took the direction it did. I do know that once I started developing the characters, including Arya, um, I didn't want a plan, and I had no plan.
Mm.
And what I would do is I couldn't wait to get back to the computer, and I'd jump in. I was so immersed in this evolving landscape and these characters. I actually started seeing myself as a scribe for this semi-religion
Mm.
that was recording events that happened during this period of time more than writing anything. And and one thing would happen, one a chapter would end, and then that would kind of dictate where I was going to go from there. It's like, and I was just telling my daughter, now that this is done, the launch is done, or at least everything I need to do for the launch, I can get back to writing part two. That's what I love to do.
Mm.
And I want to sit down and see, where's this going to go? What's going to happen next? And, I just really can't tell you how much I love immersing myself at the computer. I'm not really at the computer. I'm really in this city on this planet Urgia, writing as a scribe, overlooking the doldrums and the heat, the great desert.
So once you kind of had that in place, how did you, with the world building aspect of it, did you kind of establish like, maps, geography, languages, religions? How did that kind of fall into place for you?
Well, I really struggled with that for quite a while because I only wanted to do as much as I needed to do to carry the story. I didn't,
Okay.
I had no interest in, and I thought about that because I was reading about it. I'm always a student, so I'm reading about everything to do with writing now. This is my new thing. I'm a writer, um, but I'm fascinated with it. In all of the aspects and components to it. Let me tell you this, Barney. When I first wrote this, I didn't do any editing or nothing. Remember, my niece gave me this,
Right.
the bottles, and launched me into writing this. My only goal was to get it done enough that I could print a copy so that I could print a copy and give it to her for Christmas
Yeah.
the next year. So that was my whole goal at that point in time. So that wasn't my interest. Were really the characters, and I remember asking, like, I knew nothing. I mean, how much does a good story have to be action or characters or all of this? I feel like the descriptions of the relevant aspects of the worlds are amazing to me. I mean, I'm my biggest fan. Let me tell you that. I love this story, and it just I have very clearly in my head what Arathi City looks like and what this great desert, the heath and the doldrums look like. And I actually did my first attempt at drawing a map. That there will be a little map in there. So, but that's just the immediate area because that's where the action takes place. Although I describe, other relevant cities and things like that, but not into a lot of detail. But then, you know, different. We're going to be in different dimensions or different universes, and I really thought about the language, and how that was all going to work. And then, I start off where there's a mix of universes where the character, without giving away too much, the character doesn't understand what's being said and vice versa.
Hmm.
But they give her a tablet that helps learn language, and so the main character learns the language. That's how I dealt with it. And I love it. To me, it works. That works really well. But we went through this period where there was no understanding, and so I don't know. I guess I did some world building, and originally I had a lot of drawings of planets and things like that, but decided to get rid of all the visuals out of the book.
Hmm. That draft you wrote that you first published, how long ago was that?
Yeah, 2020. Yeah, yeah. And
Okay.
then, I had six printed, and everybody who read it, which are all friends and family, so you
Yeah.
can decide how you want to take that. The first thing they said was, "When can I read part two?"
Uh-huh.
And so I thought that was sincere, and people said they really liked the book. My niece, who gave me the bottles of wine, who's also an author, by the way, and full cycle, right? I told her all these stories, and she writes children's books, but she said, I really like it, but it's different. And I realized she said the the footnotes were a little distracting. I had like 80 references. The only thing I'd written in the past are this dissertation and
Okay.
two theses, and and so I've always written more in terms of journals and things like that. And so I went back, and I still have a lot of endnotes. But this is part of the whole idea of truth is stranger than fiction. I have a lot of quotes and things that relate to things people said, and you know, for those who might want to drill down if they have an interest, and read something about Jung or the spiritual masters, Sri Chinmoy. And my wife and I were disciples of Sri Chinmoy for a number of years before we moved to Vermont. Um, but they're all amazing authors and writers in and of themselves. And so there's the opportunity, if there's a quote or something that's being mentioned in a book with an end note and somebody's interested in that, then there's an opportunity to click on that and do some further Googling and read more about it. But so I couldn't get rid of that altogether. That's still the, sort of professional journal type writer that I'd always been. But she said get rid of the footnotes because they were distracting. I put them all at the end and
Okay.
got rid of them.
Was there any of that feedback where like you had to say, all right, I guess you're right, or were there things in there that you said you kind of stuck to your guns and said, well, I like this and I'm going to keep it in there?
My daughter read it in terms of editing,
Hmm.
and then I had friends who was like my six books that gave. I asked them for feedback. What did you like? What didn't you like? What was confusing? And and people were polite in how they said it, but you didn't have to read between the lines too hard. That there was too much on the science.
Right.
So, you know, and I realized that to me, that's fascinating and interesting. Probably it wouldn't be to most. And it also detracted from the flow of the characters and what was going on. So there's still a fair amount of that in, but I took quite a bit of that out. And I think it made for a much better book. And keep in mind, I haven't written before, Barney. So this has like been an incredible learning experience for me. I feel like I'm a much better writer now than I was when I started this process. I've learned so much. I ended up buying a subscription to Microsoft 365. It's got an editor in it. It's got a narrator in it. And by the way, like I'm a member of a lot of writers groups, and that's been so helpful. I mean, 75% maybe not, but 25% that's helpful. That's a lot, and that's very valuable. But somebody told me in editing, what really works for them is to have it narrated. And 365 has a narration function, so it reads it to you. And a great example is I've gone through it a number of times now, and I'm reading it, and it said the diver, and it should have been the driver. And it's hard to see that because it's just that one letter and they look very similar. And I missed it a lot of times, but you hear it and right off that's not good or sound right. Or so that's credit to some of my Facebook writer groups for that, because I think that really works really well. So, made a fair amount of changes based on what people said versus, because I started writing this. I wanted Carrie to like it, but I got into writing it for me, and because I was immersed in the story, and I loved the science, but with part two, that I've probably got 80 pages into that before I had to put it on halt to work on getting this up. But I think it's much better. I think it's much better written, and it's more natural for me. I know more what I'm doing. I read an article, not an article, but it came up in Facebook about Stephen King said, don't use adverbs. So I love that kind of thing because I looked that up and, made sure I knew what adverbs were, and I tried to understand why he said that. And I took out a few adverbs.
What was his reason to say don't use adverbs?
That it's unnecessary. Probably the main thing I've learned, and it's probably not fully reflected in this part one, but it will be in two, is extra words. I mean, there's so many extra words that I realize, but some of them are obvious, Barney, like, it's hot.
Right.
Do you need very hot?
Right.
Or things like that just are describers of verbs or whatever, and you read it and you think, no, I really don't need this. It's not necessary.
Right.
So I think I was way wordy initially, worked on that a lot, took out a lot of words, took out sentences that really weren't helping any.
Right.
And so that stuff I never even thought of when I started writing.
And so my other question for you is, because as you mentioned at the start of the hour, you were thinking maybe you're going to be writing a management book or something along those lines. Do you have any characters that you have written in that you've written in Beyond the Veil that are kind of represent like idealized versions of managers or supervisors, or stereotypes of the type of supervisor manager that you wouldn't want, or any of that?
Absolutely.
Really?
Almost every character is based on either a person or a combination of qualities of people. That many that I work with. I was talking to a person who was on the board while I was there, and who's one of my readers and my great supporter. And I hope she watches this. I'm not sure if I should mention names or not. Some people don't like that, but and I said, well, my main villain, I shouldn't tell you this, but my main villain is based on, I'm not saying who. She said, you better not ever say that. And it's a person, I don't want to even want to use he or she, that I really like and admire. But there's that aspect of that person that I know is there. Um, and some of the people who are the greatest people I've known and got to work with, and just my management team, just the most amazing people you can imagine. And I think of this one person who would never show it or let it out, but she's in my book an assassin. I'm telling you way too much. It's a small state.
So the characters you have in there are either representative of people you know or amalgamations of a few different personalities that you kind of put together.
Definitely characteristics of people who I've known or come across, and the leadership thing I do talk. And again, this is where you know it's not just a story. I'm weaving in my interest in science, my interest in leadership. And at one point, I talk about a person who's done something great, and I say, and the character is saying, thought that this person is a natural leader, has charisma, blah 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 blah, and I'm listing the actual textbook definition of a good leader. So that stuff definitely is interweaved with the whole story. So, and that's one of the things that's fascinating to me. It's just so many aspects of my interest in my life are, in there. The religion, the Arathi religion, which they don't call it a religion, but people see it as a religion, is based largely on my experience with Sri Chinmoy when we were disciples, years ago in Connecticut. An experience, by the way, that has um, contributed to my life in dramatic ways to this day.
How much of the stuff that you put in there are some of the influences from your work in human services, and also some of the things that influenced you growing up? But how much of it do you see, maybe so not so much in part one, but say now in part two, that how much now is basically based off of new experiences since you wrote part one?
Well, it's mostly, all of my past experiences, but
Yeah.
what's happening now, and this goes back to my intent of allowing my next chapter to unfold
Right.
organically, that what's happening is, without working and having more time, it's all coalescing. It's all coming together, and in a very rich way, that I'm very appreciative of. Um, so, I describe my retirement as the phase I'm in now is magical.
Hmm.
And the first phase was glorious. And, I talk to people who have problems adjusting to retirement. That wasn't me
Yeah.
at all. I mean, I just, expression, and I just couldn't help laughing.
Right.
And that was the first day. I worked 40 years here. I came in and saw all these people. I wonder if I had a position of authority, would I leave the organization, and would there be something within me that I was getting from
Right.
that I'm not in touch with? Because I always thought of myself as, this is me, this is who I am. I went to work that way, I interact, and but none of that. I didn't. It was strange in a way, but it's given me the opportunity to think back and think about the people and think about nature. I think a lot about nature. In my management course, you can't be a manager or a leader if you don't know something about the nature of us, of human beings. And I would always ask, what is our nature? And nobody had a clue. They all thought they did. There would be no agreement about
Right.
it astounds me that there's little agreement about what our own nature is. And I start by saying, let's look at it outside of ourselves. Like, if there's a shark, what can we say about his nature? He needs to be in the water. He doesn't like to lounge on a couch. He's a hunter. Okay, do that with us. People can't do it.
Right.
So that dominates my thinking in terms of relationships and how this unfolds and the religion, and there's no, in my mind, and I hate to say this because it sounds alien, but it's not a good or bad thing. It's really more a function of our nature.
From that, do you see when you're writing the story? I mean, like it's like there's two schools of thoughts that you think either people call them like is the book an amusement park ride or amusement park, or is it a sandbox? Meaning an amusement park is there's a certain path to go, you can't really veer off. Are you in control of the story, or is it more like a sandbox where you sit down and say, what's happening today?
Not at all. Not at all in charge of it, and don't want to be. Again, this is just my wanting to be at a point in my life where things unfold. Right. And truthfully, even if I keep saying that's why, but I don't think it is. I like going there, and it's like, to me, it's like binging on a great TV show.
Right.
I want to watch the next episode to see what's going to happen. I want to get back to writing to see what's going to happen. And I really, and my problem with my head is, throughout the day, washing dishes or doing whatever, all these ideas come in terms of what could happen. And I like them all.
Okay.
They're all great, man. I'd like to see that,
Right.
So I sit down and then, it's funny, like I leave off with something and that really suggests what has to happen next.
Right. So you're working on part 2 right now, right?
The Girl and the Dragon.
Yep. The Girl and the Dragon. Do you see you're going to be releasing, once people read part 1, when can, like what your friends were saying, when can we expect part 2? And then when can we expect part 3? Is this a year coming, or just depends on when the story's finished for part 2?
Well, I might change my mind because I'm right at the end of needing to do all this prep to get this up, which, as I said, is not my favorite part of the whole exercise. But so I had a deadline for Christmas, and as Christmas approached for my niece, it started to suck my will to live, or suck the joy out of the writing a little bit. And because now I have a time frame and blah, blah, blah. And then this, when I pre-launch here, whatever the term is, you have to set a date. And so again, it was a time frame. So, right now I'm thinking 2 things I want to do. One is get the paperback up, and I've been working on that. And so I don't think, that will be too long, but I'm not in any rush now. I did what I wanted to do for now. I'm not in any rush. And I really want to get back to writing part 2. And then the other thing is to, I'm looking forward to just writing. I've got maybe a third of it written. But I think this middle section is going to be longer. This is not that long. I don't know if it says what it is, but, and I don't know where it's going. So, it's hard to say on that, but, it's interesting. You said next Christmas, and, I'll certainly be looking to see what I can do by then.
So Bob, thank you very much. This has been exciting stuff. So looking forward to seeing this. I'm going to get myself a copy of it, and I'll be excited to take a look at it and read through it. And do you see I'm also going to be around 128 pages or so, or is this?
Yeah. So it's not that long, easy read. I love it. I'm my biggest fan. So I won't say others will love it, because who knows? Everybody has different tastes, but.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Bob. And come back on the show when Beyond the Veil Part 2 comes out. We'll chat about that.